well, and we'll get the basic stuff down now, and then we at the last taping. At the last taping, because we've got some more sessions, so we can come back and
if you want to fill in something.
If we feel that something we've left out is very important.
Okay.
The best thing is to do it right now and use what we get.
Having in mind, too, you don't have to have everything.
No,
There's
right.
just some good things you're not going to get in.
10 seconds to studio. 10 out on 3.
Looking back, where do you think Lyndon Johnson went wrong on Vietnam, and why?
Well, I think Lyndon Johnson has received a bad rap, if I may say so, from the instant historians. Lyndon Johnson was a devoted patriot. He was a consummate politician, and he was devoted to peace. The problem was that he sometimes couldn't separate himself in each of his different identities. For example, he was devoted to the Great Society. He knew also that he had to bring the war to a successful conclusion. But he put it very bluntly in his colorful way once when he said that he didn't want to have the Congress of the United States debating that bitch of a war in Vietnam rather than the woman he really loved, the Great Society. And that's Lyndon Johnson, Vintage Johnson. And so what happened was he tried to have it and eat it too, as they say. He wanted to have peace, but he didn't want to pay the price. He wanted the Great Society above everything else, and that he didn't realize that if he didn't handle Vietnam, the Great Society would be cast into disrepute as well. Another point that he went wrong on was entrusting some of the people he inherited from President Kennedy. Some of them were good, like Dean Rusk, and honorable. Others were not. The problem was that Johnson didn't know which were and which weren't until too late. And some of those that got us into Vietnam and then proceeded to mismanage it, carried over into Johnson. He later, in his rather earthy way, said to me once, he says, "They screwed me." And I think really what he was objecting to, not so much that they screwed him, because he played pretty rough himself at times, but because he was unable to do anything about it and didn't recognize it until it was too late. And then the third thing I think would be summed up by something that Winston Churchill wrote in his history of the First World War, which I think was the better of his two World War histories, where he said in war, a commander may have a policy of audacity or one of patience, or let me see, I'll repeat there, that Winston, I think in another place where he made a mistake was summed up by the way that Winston Churchill wrote it in his book about the First World War, when he said a commander could either have a policy of audacity or one of what he called prudence, but he could not have both at the same time. And Johnson did not have an audacious policy, one of using that enormous power that he had, together with the huge mandate he had with both houses of Congress, to bring the war to a quick and sharp conclusion. And on the other hand, he temporized and escalated on a cautious basis, gradual escalation, and then misled the country as to what was happening. All of this brought him neither the victory that he wanted nor the peace with honor that he wanted. And it was a great tragedy because Johnson was devoted to peace. He was devoted to his country.
Who were some of the people who screwed Johnson?
I think it wouldn't be useful to name names of some of the higher-ups, but I would say what we're talking about are people, and they are the most important of all, at the second level in the bureaucracy, in state particularly, a few in defense, etc., who at the beginning went along in this macho business that, well, we've got to be strong and hold the line every place in the world against communism. And then when push came to shove, didn't want to do what was necessary to stop communist insurrection and revolutionary warfare in Vietnam. And then when they began to see the media turning against it, they turned too. And as a result, let me put it bluntly with regard to Johnson. We sometimes hear today people say, the conservatives, let Reagan be Reagan. Johnson's problem was nobody told him, let Johnson be Johnson. If Johnson had been Johnson in Vietnam, he would have finished it before I ever got to be president. And maybe if he'd finished it, I would never have been president, so who knows?
Looking at these POWs must be a very emotional thing for you.
Yes, it was one of the great events in the White House, the biggest dinner ever held. We held it outside on the lawn for 650 of them and their wives. But also I thought back to all the times that I've talked to their wives, their mothers, their children and so forth when they were in captivity. I think back to what they have done for their country and what they went through. Some of them there 5, 6, 7 years going through torture and real torture. And I think what men they were, and I'm proud that the country could produce such men because they were really heroes in a war which had very few heroes. For example, you hear this, yes, excuse me, you wanted
We were going to, the New York Times, we're going to talk about the New York
Yeah,
Times
yeah,
and
you
the
want to finish that off,
POWs.
yes. Oh, yes.
Looking,
I'm sorry,
looking at these POWs must be a very emotional
well,
thing for you.
yes,
Excuse me a second, just keep rolling, everybody. Can I just take that question over?
Yes.
yeah, I see. We wanted,
Sorry.
I was leapfrogging, but that part is a good part to include in a later point. Go ahead.
Looking at these POWs must be a very emotional thing for you.
Yes, it is when I think what they went through. Torture, all those years in captivity. I know this from having talked to their wives and their mothers over those years before they came home. And I also think of how I just wish we could have gotten back sooner. And I must say that I couldn't possibly disagree more with what the publisher of the New York Times or somebody representing the New York Times had said in that famous Pentagon Papers case, that the right of the New York Times under the First Amendment to print these top secret documents, the Pentagon Papers, should take precedence over the right of POWs to come home a little sooner. Let me say, I think that's obscene. I believe in the First Amendment. But as Lincoln said about the right of excuse me. Right, I'll start that. I believe, of course, in the First Amendment. But we have to realize that this was wartime. And in wartime, I don't believe anything can take precedence over the responsibility of the nation and the commander-in-chief to bring home their POWs and to save any American lives. And anything that prolonged that war, which I believe the printing of the Pentagon Papers did and its publication, certainly, I think, cannot be justified on First Amendment grounds.
Different war critics went to North Vietnam and to Hanoi. Jane Fonda broadcast over radio Hanoi urging American bomber pilots not to to do bombing runs over North Vietnam. She, Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General, other anti-war leaders met with various groups of POWs and came back and reported that they were being well treated. We have two clips of Jane Fonda and Ramsey Clark just after they had come back from a visit to North Vietnam.
politically. Or, as the foreign minister said, cares more about the Chew government than about the American prisoners.
Richard Nixon has gone further than any human being, in my opinion, has ever gone in terms of slaughter, in terms of crimes committed against humanity. As I said before, he has had perfected and ordered the use of weapons that are illegal, that have been outlawed by many conventions which the United States is a signatory of. And I think that it is his cynicism and his lying and his murder that makes me desperately mad to see him get out of office, and why I think that anyone who cares about this country will do everything we can to see that happen. He is a blight on the name of America. What they said was, without exception, first of all, what is happening in the United States about the peace movement, we are very worried that Nixon will stay in office because we think if he does, we're going to stay in here for God knows how long.
How do you feel when you see films like that?
Well, I frankly am not surprised at Jane Fonda, because you kind of expect a celebrity, a movie star, to be a bit erratic at times. But I just can't believe that Ramsey Clark would talk that way, a former Attorney General whose father was a fine Attorney General and a great justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, making such absolutely stupid, asinine, false comments. And I just hope that he sometimes does talk to some of these POWs who return. Talk to Jeremiah Denton, who described what had happened to the POWs as in a book which was entitled When Hell Was in Session. Look at the analyses made by the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, which indicate that over 60% of the prisoners were tortured. Get the story with regard to some of those that saw Ramsey Clark and that saw Jane Fonda. One of them, who had a broken arm, was hung by his arm like this until he agreed to see her. He didn't want to do so. Another who refused to see Ramsey Clark and Jane Fonda had both of his legs broken because he wouldn't do so. And then in addition to that, they did such things as to take them and pull their fingernails out in order to get them to see visiting delegations to show how humanely they were being treated. No, they were not treated in that way. And may I say also, when Ramsey Clark talks about bombing hospitals and dikes and so forth, he knows much better than that, because all bombing, of course, is inhumane in a sense, because some people, civilian or otherwise, may be killed. But on the other hand, that is simply not the record.
If you met Ramsey Clark or Jane Fonda at a reception, or if you met them today, would you shake hands with them? Would you talk to them? And what would you say to them?
Well, I don't think I'm going to be confronted with that problem, so therefore I'm not going to answer the question.
Do you think that because of Jane Fonda's and Ramsey Clark's visits to North Vietnam, the war was prolonged, the casualties were increased, and, as you say, the POWs were tortured?
Yeah, ironically and tragically, yes. And I say that tragically from their standpoint. I don't question that both Jane Fonda and Ramsey Clark wanted to bring the war to an end, just as I wanted to bring it to an end, and as Johnson wanted to bring it to an end. But on the other hand, what they did gave aid and comfort to the enemy by causing division in the United States, by causing more support against the war in the United States, and above everything else, by encouraging the North Vietnamese to hold on. Like when you hear Jane Fonda say, "I hope that Nixon is defeated," and so forth. Well, you can see what that does to the North Vietnamese as they sit across the table from Henry Kissinger. They're going to say, well, maybe he will be defeated, we'll wait for McGovern. And they did do that for quite a while. It was only when they thought McGovern was down the tube that they finally negotiated seriously. But believe me, as a result of what Jane Fonda and Ramsey Clark and others who went over there, who said they went for the purpose of stopping the war, as a result of what they did, they prolonged it. And they were responsible, without intending it, but they were responsible for the deaths of Americans who were killed.
You say that people should expect actresses or celebrities to be erratic. Why then does the political involvement of celebrities have such impact, and why does the media give it such coverage?
Because the media likes actors. Now, fortunately, I'm glad they like one actor, President Reagan, but he's much more than an actor. He is a world statesman, in my view, and has demonstrated that, and he uses that enormous acting capability to communicate very effectively with the American people. But let's face it, the actor, whether he's in politics or anything else, is a much more interesting, capable performer than one who is not an actor. And I say that as one who is definitely not an actor.
The fact that the POWs were tortured, couldn't that be the result of the intensity of emotion that their captors felt for them? Does that necessarily apply to the entire, to the enemy or to the nature of the enemy in that conflict?
Oh, no, as a matter of fact, I've heard that argument. Well, that was an exception. After all, these people have been bombing innocent people in hospitals, and therefore it was justified, or at least if not justified, it is understandable that they'd want to torture those that have been doing it. But let me tell you, that was a way of life for these people. The North Vietnamese were as brutal, as cruel, as any aggressors in history. And just two or three examples that come to mind. I remember, for example, reading after 1968 that in Hue, a town that they overran in Vietnam, that they uncovered a mass grave with 2,800 people in it, and many of them had been buried alive. I recall another incident in the great offensive that they launched in 1972. If they came into a village that they felt might have people that were supporting the other side, our side was concerned, they would take action against them. And in one case, they took 50 men and 150 of their children and their wives out together in an area. They buried the 50 men alive, but even worse, made their wives and children watch when they buried them alive. Others, they disemboweled while they were alive and made the wives and children watch. You could go on and on. The point is that the atrocities and engaging in atrocities was a way of life for these people. Like in our case, when Calais, in that famous Calais case, engaged in actions against civilians which were beyond and in violation of the rules of engagement as we laid them down. He was prosecuted. I refused to pardon him, and he had to pay the price for it. In North Vietnam, he would have got a medal for that. That's the difference between the two.
Is it would you say it is a racial, maybe not use these words, but that it is a racial stereotype to say that the North Vietnamese are a vicious, brutal people?
Well, let me say that the Vietnamese, as a people, traditionally in Asia have considered to be the most militaristic, the most aggressive. And there is a different attitude, or has been historically, in Vietnam, in China for that matter, a different attitude toward human life and so forth than in some other areas. Let us all understand that those who happen to be of European background and so forth shouldn't say now that never happened with us. You look back at the earlier stages in European history, and there's some pretty horrible examples of brutality, and even of our own history and our treatment of Indians and the rest. But let me say that in today's world, there is no more brutal example of what I would say would be inhuman treatment than what was visited not only upon our POWs, but also on civilians in South Vietnam by the North Vietnamese. It was deliberate, it was ordered, and those that did it were commended for it.
Around the fall of 1972, the North Vietnamese indicated that they were prepared to reach a peace agreement before the presidential election in November, and negotiations reached a new pitch. Henry Kissinger came back, and at the end of October, he went into the White House briefing room and told a anxiously waiting nation and world about the state of the negotiations. We have a clip of that briefing.
We've got to get the offensive in May 8th before that.
Ladies and gentlemen,
You're going to come back to that?
we've now heard from
What did the announcement, which turned out to be premature, that peace is at hand, do to your ability and to Henry Kissinger's ability to negotiate a peace to end the war?
Well, Henry Kissinger realized right after that conference that he had overstated and had in fact misspoken what he intended. And what it did, of course, is that when he said peace is at hand before the election, the North Vietnamese said, well, now they have to have peace before the election. And so they got more intransigent as a result, rather than reaching the agreement that was needed to be reached on some of the outstanding issues between them and the South Vietnamese.
There are widespread stories in articles and memoirs of the time that during this period, under the enormous pressure of going back and forth and trying to negotiate an end to the war, that Henry Kissinger became extremely emotional, that he threatened to resign several times or submitted his resignation, that he became almost pathological in his dislike and distrust of President Thieu, that he became almost obsessive in his commitment to signing the agreement on a certain deadline. Is there any truth to those reports?
Well, I think he would be the first to say that it was a very emotional period for all of us. And he would be the first to say that he was at times emotional, but I must say in his defense there were reasons for that. You mentioned the fact that he was almost pathologically concerned about Thieu's intransigence. Let me say he was even more concerned about North Vietnam's intransigence. It was tough. He'd been negotiating with them, with the Chinese, with the Russians and so forth. It was a superhuman job, and I don't know how he kept his senses about him to the extent that he did. But I remember after one of his trips, I think it was just before the Peace is at Hand statement, he came in and told me of the very great problems he was having with the North Vietnamese on a little piddly change in the agreement that the South Vietnamese wanted. And he said, they're just shits, the North Vietnamese. They're just tawdry shits. When it comes to negotiating, they make the Russians look good. They make the Chinese look good, just like the Chinese make the Russians look good. Let me repeat that. I remember his coming in, and he just threw up his hands and he said, you know, they're just shits. When it comes to negotiating, they make the Chinese look good, just like the Chinese make the Russians look good. Now, Thieu was difficult, but there were reasons for him to be difficult. He mistrusted the North Vietnamese, and facts proved him to be right. He thought they were going to break the agreement. He also had to prepare his population for it. And so consequently, he wanted to buy as much time as he could to get the right kind of a deal. It was only after I gave assurances that we would back him up, and also when I put some very heavy pressure on him that if he didn't go along, we would have to make agreement on our own, that he finally did agree to the peace agreement, which we eventually signed.
Is it at all arguable that a more even-tempered negotiator than Henry Kissinger might have had or that the presence of a more even-tempered negotiator might have had an effect on the progress of the peace talks, and that an agreement might have been reached earlier?
No, I would disagree with that totally. I think Kissinger did a monumental job on that. See, it was hour after hour after hour that he had to negotiate. When you're negotiating with communists, I've done a little of it over my period of time too, they just want to wear you out. And Henry had enormous stamina, enormous patience. No, I would have to say I am just surprised he was able to do as well as he did. And also, he got a deal.
You mentioned the assurances that you gave President Thieu. They later became controversial. Is it constitutional, is it legal for a president unilaterally and in advance to make commitments of American military action?
It depends on the circumstances. In these circumstances, I believe so, because the military action which was pledged was for the purpose of keeping a peace agreement, which we were to agree to, and which I was sure the Congress was going to approve, or the Senate would approve. And if in order to keep that agreement, in order to keep our commitments under the agreement, it was necessary to use military force, I think it would be justified. And I was simply indicating that that's what I intended to do. If they signed the agreement, we, on our side, would see that it was kept. Because the agreement provided, among other things, you know, that we would provide to the South Vietnamese an equal amount of arms as was provided to the North. And that part of the agreement was not kept later, as you well know.
How did you feel when the Congress refused to honor those assurances that you had made?
Well, I thought it was a tragedy, just as much was a tragedy in that year, 1973 and 1974. And I knew, or at least I thought I knew, that eventually would lead to snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Because you must understand that when people say, well, that agreement was no good, that for 2 years after the peace agreement of 1973, for 2 years, the South Vietnamese kept every provincial capital, despite the fact that the North had new equipment that they received from the Russians, were launching offensives, breaking the agreement virtually every day. That's an indication of the fact that had the Congress not cut the legs out from under Thieu by cutting back on the tanks and other materiel that he needed, so that the North Vietnamese had a 4-to-1 advantage in heavy artillery and tanks when they launched their final offensive, South Vietnam would be free today, and we wouldn't have had the boat people and the other tragedy that has been visited upon that poor country.
In a recent article in the New Yorker, William F. Buckley wrote in passing, and it was a diary he kept, and he wrote in passing that if Richard Nixon had been president, had stayed on as president, that we wouldn't have had boat people. Is that true?
Well, I would hope so. As a matter of fact, even though I was under, as you know, a rather sustained and eventually fatal attack on the Watergate issue, that I was trying as best I could to serve what I consider to be the responsibilities of the presidency. That's why, for example, in 1973, when Israel was about to go down the tube, I nevertheless ordered an alert of American forces, which was a very risky thing to do around the world, and ordered a huge airlift to Israel to save them. That was when Watergate, of course, was beginning to heat up. I am sure that if I had been able to stay in office, that first I would have done something in order to prevent what eventually happened. But second, it wouldn't have been necessary to do anything, due to the fact that I had already established my credibility with the North by what I had done just 3 weeks before the Soviet summit in 1972, when I ordered the bombing and mining of Haiphong, even though it might risk the summit, and what I did, the most difficult military decision of my whole presidency at the time of the Christmas, so-called Christmas bombing of 1972, which brought the war to an end through the peace agreement. Those actions indicated that I was willing to take any political risk in order to prevent the North Vietnamese from winning the victory that they wanted to win.
People often wonder how Watergate weighs on you in these years after your resignation. Would you say that the knowledge that because of Watergate you had to resign and because of your resignation Vietnam fell is part of the legacy you take from Watergate?
Yes, to an extent. It may have fallen anyway had we stayed in there. I should point out that before Watergate became an issue, however, it was getting to be a very dicey problem. You may recall that early in January, right after our overwhelming election victory in November, that the Democratic caucus in the House voted by a margin of 2-to-1, 150 to 75, and in the Senate by a margin of almost 3-to-1, 36 to 12, to withdraw from Vietnam in return for our prisoners of war, which of course would be a total capitulation, and which would have resulted in even the denial of 2 years of non-communist government for the South Vietnamese. Fortunately, we were able to prevent that, because within a week after they passed those resolutions, on January the 9th, my 60th birthday, I received the call from Henry in Paris that we had made the deal, which I announced on the 23rd.
When did you realize that you weren't going to get a pre-election peace settlement, and what did you do as a result of that realization?
Well, I can't say specifically, except I would speculate about 4 to 5 days before the election. This was after the Peace is at Hand statement. It was when the reports that Henry was having insofar as his meetings with Thieu were concerned that they weren't going that well and that he was unable to bridge the gap which existed between Thieu and the North Vietnamese. And then, at that point, when it was so clear that I was going to win overwhelmingly, there was nothing that the North Vietnamese could do to affect the election. Let me put it another way. Curiously enough, as long as it was, as the election was a close thing, of course, and a hope that they might win, that was a deterrent to them, a deterrent for their agreeing to anything. Why deal with Nixon? Wait for McGovern and get it all, because he was offering terms that had already, as a matter of fact, been turned down by the North Vietnamese, but which went much further than anything that we had offered. The other thing is that as you got closer to the election, however, and it appeared that we were going to win overwhelmingly, I think they realized that I was not going to make any further concessions, and so they said, well, we'll wait till afterwards, and then hope to wear us out then. And that's what happened, of course.
Why did you initiate the Christmas bombing, the massive bombing of North Vietnam, beginning I think on December 18th, right before Christmas in 1972?
Well, let's contrast that with the earlier bombing. The first bombing that took place, bombing and mining, was on May 8th of 1972. That was 3 weeks before the Soviet summit. That was initiated because of a huge North Vietnamese invasion with 24 divisions of South Vietnam. And people said, oh, don't bomb, don't mine, because we've got to have the Soviet summit. And I said, look, no president can go to Moscow and sit there in the Kremlin and negotiate with Brezhnev with Russian tanks rumbling through the streets of Hue and Saigon. So we bombed, we mined, and they still had the summit.
Did you think they wouldn't? Did you think that the summit would be
I
canceled?
thought it was a very close thing, and Henry thought it was about 25% only chance that they would go forward with it.
If you had known in advance for sure that the Soviets would cancel the summit, and that would mean that the SALT agreement would have fallen away, if you had known for sure in advance that they were going to cancel it, would you still have made the May 8th speech and announced the bombing of Hanoi and the mining of Haiphong?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because if we had gone there to the Kremlin, with Vietnam having fallen or in the process of falling, Brezhnev would be looking right down my throat, and we wouldn't have gotten even a deal on salt that we got. And many people, of course, among my friends in the Hawk community think that wasn't a good deal either, although I happen to think it was. No, absolutely not. I remember John Connolly, who, in his rather colorful Texan way, put it to me. He said, look, when I asked him what he would do about this particular matter, about risking the summit and so forth, he said, you can lose the summit. He was speaking politically. But you cannot lose this war. He says, if you lose this war, you're going to lose the election. And he said, go ahead and bomb and mine. He said, and then stuff it right down their throats. I don't think they're going to cancel. Well, he proved to be right, and I'm glad he did.
Throughout your administration, almost from the very first days, you initiated a policy of linkage where you insisted to the Soviets that in order to get things that they wanted, they had to help us or agree to things that we wanted. One of them was their help in pressuring Hanoi to end the war. How much did they ever do that, and how much did they really want to help us? How much did the Soviets really want to help us end the war?
Well, they were between the rock and a hard place on that one. They wanted good relations with us, not simply because of arms control, but because they were very interested in what we would be able to do together in the economic area, where they really wanted to have cooperation. And a lot of things were developing there that were very promising for them and for us as well. On the other hand, while they wanted good relations with the United States at that level, they could not afford, as the leader of the international communist movement, to be caught not supporting a war of liberation by their allies in North Vietnam in South Vietnam, particularly because they didn't want to give the Chinese a chance to say that the Soviet had turned off on and backed down from their support of North Vietnam. And so under the circumstances, they were in a very difficult position. On the other hand, my view is that they came down, not very heavily, but at least in a way that was helpful on the side of better relations with us. I think, in other words, without the Soviet Union nudging the North Vietnamese, we wouldn't probably have made the progress we did before the election and thereafter. And I think that after the election, while we don't have any specifics on this, I think that they perhaps did use their influence toward getting an agreement. Now, having said that, however, I think that it was more a question not of their going to the North Vietnamese and say, look here, make a deal. I don't think that's the way it is. But I think the way it happened was, and the same thing I think happened with the Chinese, the Soviet Union and the Chinese did not encourage the North Vietnamese to stick it to us. And that made a very big difference, because the Chinese, because of our initiative toward China, while they were still supporting vocally and orally and publicly the North Vietnamese, weren't giving them the needle that they normally would be giving of provocation, and neither were the Russians. And I think as the North Vietnamese, who were very suspicious anyway, as they looked at the Soviet, they looked at our meeting and clinking glasses with the Soviet in Moscow, as they saw us meeting with the Chinese in China, and of course eventually they became enemies of the Chinese, that probably gave them a little pause, and they didn't want to be out there alone. So all of these factors, I think, helped bring it about.
When you initiated the Christmas bombing, there was an enormous uproar and furor. One senator said you had taken leave of your senses. Another commentator said that it was Stone Age tactics. Why did you do it, and why did you do it in such force at such a time?
Well, I would say that as far as the bombing was concerned, it was without question the most difficult military decision that I made, because everything seemed to be going so well. We had won the election overwhelmingly. The peace agreement seemed to be on track. At least we thought it was. And then what happened was that for reasons that we could not understand, the North Vietnamese backed off of the position they'd taken on October 12th before the election, backed off even on the matter of our POWs. They weren't going as far as we had insisted they were going with regard to their being returned without any conditions whatever. There were other matters that many people think are not important, but they were very important, certainly to the South Vietnamese, and we consider them also important to us. So under the circumstances, what I saw here was that the North Vietnamese were waiting for the Congress to get back. They had pretty good intelligence insofar as what was going in our Congress, and they probably anticipated what I indicated happened a little earlier in this broadcast, that the Congress was going to put great pressure on us just to bug out without any agreement whatever, such as we had already reached earlier before the election. And so under the circumstances, I decided it was time to get it over with, and get it over with before the Congress got back. And so we bombed and we mined. Now let me say one other thing. When they talk about Stone Age tactics and carpet bombing and Christmas bombing, all of these charges are, one, wrong, and two, mythical. First, well, perhaps the Stone Age thing, I don't know what they mean by that. But as far as Christmas bombing, of course we didn't bomb on Christmas. We took a 48-hour period when we didn't bomb. Not that that doesn't mean that we didn't bomb before and afterwards. But the second point is, insofar as carpet bombing is concerned, Anthony Lewis and other commentators practically went out of their minds because they said we were bombing thousands of innocent people and hospitals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not true. We lost some B-52s because we insisted that it not be area bombing. It was very precise. It was on military targets only. And the North Vietnamese later admitted that less than 900 people were killed, civilians who were living right in the area. Well, that's too many. But on the other hand, this was not aimed at civilian populations. It was only on military targets. It was effective. It brought the North Vietnamese to the conference table, and they made an agreement. And it ended the war as far as we were concerned, and at least temporarily as far as the South Vietnamese were concerned.
What was that Christmas of 1972 like for you? Your daughters and their husbands were away. You and Mrs. Nixon were alone in Florida. The press was almost unanimously against you. Congress was up in arms. What was it like to spend Christmas of 1972 at Key Biscayne for Richard Nixon?
Pretty dreary. Weather wasn't that good in Florida either at that time. You know, sometimes it can be rather poor even in December, but that wasn't the real problem. Weather doesn't bother me that much. Well, like Christmas calls, you know, usually I get a lot of telephone calls in Christmas. I don't recall but about one or two that year from members of the cabinet and so forth. I don't mean that they were all opposed to the bombing, but I mean they probably knew it was a very tough time, and everybody was terribly let down, terribly depressed. We won a great election victory. Peace was at hand. And then all of a sudden, boom, we were catching hell from all sides. Obviously, I frankly didn't torture myself, and Mrs. Nixon didn't either, by watching the TV. If we had, we probably would have lost our Christmas dinner, which was not a bad one, incidentally, prepared by the Filipino chefs. But anyway, we survived it. But I would say it was perhaps as depressing a Christmas, and certainly as depressing a Christmas as we had during the White House years, more so than the Watergate Christmas.
Did you feel that people deserted you?
No, I understood what had happened. By that I meant that if people, see, I try to put myself into the position of the person sitting in front of that tube and hearing the commentators go on and on about the horrible bombings and so forth, the murderer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if they hear all that, then obviously they're going to be very confused, and some of them are going, at least temporarily, going to lose their support. They're going to think maybe the guy is out of his mind. Maybe he is just a brutal barbarian, et cetera, et cetera. I understood it. But what sustained me in that period was that I was convinced it was the only decision we could make. I convinced it was right. I was also convinced that it would break the deadlock in the negotiations. Henry Kissinger agreed that that was the case, and thank heaven we proved to be right.
On January 23rd, 1973, you went on national television from the Oval Office and you made the following statement.
Good evening. I have asked for this radio and television time that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
How did it feel at last to make that announcement?
Well, you have many mountaintop experiences as president, and you have some very deep in the valley too, as you know. But that had to be not only the greatest experience as president, but also, I think, of all my public life. Greater than being inaugurated for president the first time or the second time, or even winning the vice presidency, of course, with President Eisenhower, pretty good partner, winning the presidency in 52 and 56. And the reason for it, I suppose, is that I was so deeply involved in the Vietnam issue. You see, people forget, some do, I think, that I've lived with the Vietnamese and with this issue for 30 years now, in this year, 1983. It was 1953 I first went there. And I didn't think of Vietnam as just a nation far away, people we know very little about, as one former Secretary of State once described one country. But I thought of them for the good people they could be. I knew of the suffering they had undergone. I knew of the sacrifice that had been made first by French and then by Americans to prevent the communists from taking over. I knew of the brutality of the North Vietnamese. I knew, for example, from a conversation that I had with the Catholic Bishop of Da Nang in 1956. This was after the two countries, after the partition of Vietnam, that when the North Vietnamese took over in the Hanoi area, that 50,000 civilians at least, most of them Catholics, were executed, and 400,000 or 500,000 were starved to death. I knew that all those things had happened. And then another thing that's in a very personal sense as a president, and only a president goes through, I signed the letters that went to the next of kin. I didn't see them all. I couldn't. I, of course, developed the letter. It was a form, but it was all, of course, from the White House to the next of kin. And also, I had, on Christmas, it was my practice quite often during the war to make Christmas calls. And I called the next of kin, the wives, the widows, I should say, sometimes the children, sometimes the fathers of people that had died there. And those were heart-rending experiences. And then, of course, I had thought of the POWs who were also to come back. And I guess what I'm really trying to say is that for me, it wasn't just a political experience or a diplomatic experience, and those can be great, like going to China is a great diplomatic experience, a very highlight. But this was an emotional experience that completely overwhelmed all the rest. And to think that finally, after, frankly, 25 years of war in that poor country, we were going to have peace, an uneasy one, but peace. And that what we had fought for and sacrificed for so long, had been achieved. Believe me, it was an experience that I had never had before, and of course do not expect to have again.
How would you answer the critics who say that in fact it was a rather misleading speech, in that you knew, or you certainly anticipated, and as indeed was the case within a couple of days, that the North Vietnamese were going to break the accords, and to have been accurate or absolutely truthful, you should have said, we now have a very fragile peace in South Vietnam, but in order to make sure it lasts, we're going to have to continue very heavy, substantial bombing of two neutral countries, Cambodia and Laos, for at least the next several months, with the risk of substantial casualties and losses during that time. Would that have been a more accurate context into which to put the January settlements?
It might have been accurate in retrospect, but it wasn't at the time. After all, this statement was made on the 23rd. The agreement wasn't signed on the 27th. And I wasn't about to say on the 23rd that we expect, after we sign this agreement, to start bombing Laos and Cambodia. The reason we bombed Laos and Cambodia later, and that was in February, of course, and in March, the reason was that the North Vietnamese, not frankly to our surprise, continued to violate some of the provisions of the agreement. At least we thought there were provisions of the agreement, although Cambodia and Laos wasn't covered in them as specifically as we would have liked. And so therefore, in order to preserve the peace in South Vietnam, we had to bomb their sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos.
There are schools of thought that although you were sincerely dedicated to the proposition that the peace agreements could work, that others, and Henry Kissinger among them, really only saw them, as the phrase became, as a decent interval between the withdrawal of American forces and the inevitable, and some people felt desirable, fall of South Vietnam. Is there any validity to that argument?
Well, others may have thought it, but I did not think that at all. And I wouldn't have made that kind of a deal if I thought so. Let me say, to those who say, however, that we should not have made the agreement and we should have just continued to bomb until we had bombed the North Vietnamese back into the Stone Age, let me say that that was no longer politically viable. Witness, before Watergate, what the Democratic caucus had done in early January. That shows you that we were doing all that we could do politically in order to hold on as long as we did. The second point is this. I knew the agreement was fragile, but on the other hand, I also felt that with the credibility that I had in the minds of the North Vietnamese, witness what I had done in May of 1972 when I bombed and ordered the bombing and mining of Hanoi and Haiphong, and the so-called Christmas bombing of 1972, I thought that that very threat would be enough to at least keep them from launching a major offensive. And let me say that for the balance of my service as president, it did. And as a matter of fact, for 2 years after the peace agreement, the North Vietnamese while they were violating the ceasefire and so forth and so on, did not conquer a provincial capital. Let me just understand one thing. You talk about who lost Vietnam. The American soldiers didn't lose Vietnam. Neither did the South Vietnamese lose Vietnam. It was lost because the Congress of the United States, egged on by the media and by the best and the brightest in the intellectual establishment, etc., cut back on the aid, military aid to South Vietnam to balance what the Russians were doing for the North. And I would say to future presidents and so forth, whatever our foreign policy is, any place in the world, particularly in small countries like this, let's just be sure it's an even fight. Let's be sure we do as much for our friends and allies as the Soviet Union does for its allies. If we don't, we are going to lose without ever having a major war.
Some political commentators today say that now that we have recovered from the trauma, and it's taken this long, of the first war America lost, that people are going to become intensely interested in it again, and indeed there's going to be a populist revision, and people are going to look around to answer the question, just as in the 40s they asked who lost Europe, and in the 50s they asked who lost China, that an important political question in the 1980s is going to be who lost Vietnam. Do you think, and in populist terms, the answer is going to be Congress, the media, the universities, the corporate boards. Do you think that there is going to be a bitter revisionism in which people are going to look to point a finger and say who lost Vietnam, and who are they going to point the finger at?
I rather doubt it. I think there should be. I think there will be a few who will write that, and a few who will perhaps say it. But we have to understand here that as far as the intellectual leadership of this country is concerned, that in a figure of a percentage of at least 90%, they felt, one, at the end, it was a mistake to be in Vietnam in the first place. Two, that it was conducted improperly. They didn't like the bombing or anything else. And three, that we should have gotten out earlier. And in any event, four, good riddance. Now, it is true that they have a bit of a guilt complex now, somewhat a guilt complex, when they see the genocide that has been visited upon the Cambodians, and the murder and the repression that has been visited upon, of course, the South Vietnamese as well as the Laotians. But on the other hand, even that they rationalize by blaming the Nixon administration for brutalizing the Cambodians. We were trying to prevent those who either starved to death or killed 3 million or 2 million Cambodians, whatever the case might be, and here they blame us for doing it. So it does show you that as far as the intellectual leadership of this country is concerned, that on Vietnam, I think they had a vested interest, as it turned out, in defeat there, and now they have a vested interest in seeing that history is not rewritten to report what actually happened.
Isn't it true, though, that in Cambodia, at the beginning of the American extension of the war into that neutral country, there were about 6,000 Khmer Rouge forces. As the American bombing went in and more of the country was devastated and more of the people were forced to make choices, they swelled the ranks of the Khmer Rouge so that when the communists finally took over, there were 60,000 of them, and they were able to impose this deadly, genocidal, brutal rule. So that it really was the American extension of the war which led to the swelling of the Khmer Rouge, which led to the...
No, I don't buy that. That's the Shawcross argument, and I can only say that as looking at Cambodia and what happened there, there's no question in my mind that Cambodia, just like the Viet Cong and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and the Viet Cong in South Vietnam, they developed, of course, their own capabilities. It is true that they expanded their control over parts of the country, but the idea that we drove them back into the country, that brutalized them, That's nonsense. They were that way before we ever came in. And let's understand, when we talk about what the United States did as far as Cambodia is concerned, we weren't going in there to kill Khmer Rouge. We were going in there to knock out Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, who were using neutral Cambodia as a launching pad to kill Americans and our South Vietnamese allies. And my only regret, incidentally, about the so-called incursion of Cambodia is I didn't do it earlier. I wish I'd have done it earlier in January, and I should have done early in January 1969, shortly after I became president. I think it might have raised a lot of problems then, because you remember the election was pretty rough. You remember what happened to Hubert Humphrey at Chicago. He had demonstrations. I had some pretty rough demonstrations. And under the circumstances, therefore, remembering too what happened on inaugural day when the Secret Service wouldn't even let me ride in an open car down to the inaugural stand because of the demonstrators, thousands of them out there. Under the circumstances, to take that sort of action then might have been difficult. But in retrospect, had I had to do over again, knowing that the North Vietnamese had no intention whatever of honoring the conditions or agreements, whatever they were, about the bombing halt, having all those things in mind, what should have been done was to move in on their sanctuaries in Cambodia earlier and knock them out.
It seems that a most common denominator of your retrospective thought about Vietnam is that if you have one regret, it's that at every point you didn't move earlier, harder, faster. Is that true?
Yes, that's true. Having in mind the fact that it would not make sense to move earlier, harder, and faster if it proved to be, shall we say, disproportionate to what you might gain. I know that you usually think of Clausewitz as being one who simply is an advocate of total war, which is not true. He was a very sophisticated observer about warfare generally. He makes the point, and other military analysts have made the same point, that force must always be used, having in mind the goal to be gained and the risks and the costs in the event you use that amount of force. That is why bombing dikes, I think, would have proved to be counterproductive throughout Asia. Using tactical nuclear weapons, the same. I think, however, insofar as bombing and mining North Vietnam is concerned, or moving into the Cambodian sanctuaries, that was a possibility in 1969, except for the fact that we were hamstrung by the bombing halt and also by the American opposition. We had to lay the foundation for it, which we did do by developing our Vietnamization program and by also developing our withdrawal. Let me say finally in that respect, an argument against the proposition I've just laid down, why didn't we do it earlier, is that in those early days also, we were thinking about an initiative toward the Russians. We were thinking about an initiative toward the Chinese. I did not yet know how they might react. I don't mean that they would intervene, but I thought it was vitally important in my presidency to make a breakthrough to China and also to make some move toward negotiation rather than confrontation with the Russians. I didn't want to take action in Vietnam early in the administration, which might abort those initiatives before it started. So there are arguments the other way too.
Within a couple of months in 1975, South Vietnam ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. We have some film of those last days in Saigon. Was America humiliated in Vietnam?
The United States, in the minds of the world, yes, I think was humiliated. But let me distinguish. Not our fighting men. They didn't lose this. I think what happened there was that the United States, insofar as it's being a nation with the will and with the credibility to stand by its friends when the going got particularly difficult, that was, of course, very seriously eroded by what happened there in Vietnam. Let me say, incidentally, as I look at that, I saw them getting on those boats in the Saigon River, but I think of the boat people. Thousands and thousands, of course, as you know, tried to escape from South Vietnam by boat. And the last number I saw, at least 40,000 drowned. We don't know how many starved to death in those overloaded boats and so forth and so on. But I should point out that with all the talk about Thieus and earlier Diem's corruption and repression and so forth, that at least under them they had some freedom, they had some free press, they had some free parliaments, freely elected parliaments and so forth, they had some opposition, and now they have none. And I should also point out that there were never any boat people. All the traffic was from north to south. And I should also point out that there were reasons for these people to leave. We talk about atrocities, and we think of people being, for example, buried alive and disemboweled and so forth and so on. But one that really touched me, I mean, very deeply, I suppose, to show you the ends to which they go, the cruelty of these people. One poor devil who was a barber had been found that he had cut the hair of several American servicemen. And so they took him and chopped off his hands like that. That's what these people were going away from, and that's what they're having today.
Do you think that there are still missing American actions in Indochina?
Oh, I think so. I would be surprised if there were not. Unfortunately, I have no idea as to how possibly you can do anything about it.
I think that's our